Hey guys, reviewing while driving. Gene here once again, coming to you about Game of Thrones characters post season 6. Let's talk Sansa Stark. So, Sansa is probably one of the more changed characters as the series has gone on. And, you know, some of that was inevitable due to just her being young when we first meet her. But I think that you've got here this three-sided person that we'll get into, and essentially that person is guided by the three main influences in her life. So when we first meet her, she is living in this Barbie princess fantasy world. She is the eldest daughter of House Stark. It looks like she's going to be promised to Joffrey Baratheon, and she's going to be the queen. You know, Ned and Robert are going to join their houses, and she's going to be a part of that. So, of course, when the king's entourage arrives in Winterfell, she couldn't be more excited. And all of her upbringing has been one of preparing her for this sort of a moment. Even though Kat and Ned didn't exactly, you know, raise her in the fairy tale castle, she's been fed a steady diet of that sort of fairy tale and that sort of, you know, hyperbole of an existence where her charming prince is going to marry her. And so she learns all of the noble female crafts. You know, she knows how to sew, which we, you know, see later, of course, in season 6. But she's got all those traditional girly girl, noble woman talents. Okay, and so her ideals are fit to match, and she's been, you know, raised by pretty much the ultimate dad, Ned, who is super honorable, who is firm and fair and completely devoted to family. You know, and this mother who's also very traditional and family oriented. And so she really believes that there's going to be some Stark-like person who's going to be out there, you know, to sweep her off her feet and you know, where they can make babies and live in this castle in the sky, right? I mean, that's how she thinks this is all going to go down. And, you know, because she's so sheltered, she really has no comprehension that there's this other world out there of really nasty people, and that really this bubble she's been living in is replicated maybe only in one or two other places at the most. I mean, this is not a I mean, it's a harsh, you know, brutal place, Westeros. And pretty much the entire series is about, up until season 6, is about Sansa being disenfranchised from that mistaken belief. I mean, it's the entire progression of her character is about being abused, being used, being lied to, being manipulated. She's essentially treated much like Tommen was, although, you know, Tommen obviously gets it in some ways worse, in some ways not as bad. But she doesn't realize that what makes her desirable is not because she's a pretty redheaded girl from the north. What makes her desirable is that she is a female bit of flesh that has the Stark name, and that is her ticket to the future, not necessarily all of her other, you know, characteristics. I mean, she was pretty much raised not to understand the facts of life, and you can really see this in comparison with somebody later on who we meet, who she could have grown up to be very much like, which is Marjorie. I mean, Marjorie knew very much that growing up, that, you know, how to play the game, what her strengths were, how to play to those strengths, and what to do with it. And she was positioned correctly, Marjorie was, to, you know, exploit her advantages. Not so much Sansa. Very naive. I mean, extremely naive. And that's one thing where, you know, poor Ned, I mean, he didn't really do her any favors, right? I mean, he essentially set her up for this by not exposing her to, you know, the real world sooner. So this Stark honor, naivete, being a good person, that is her first influence that she is disillusioned from. Now she does come back to it later, but that's her first main influence. And so then, as the seasons progress, particularly up until the time when Joffrey dies, she is subjected to more and more and more brutal treatment at the hands of Joffrey. And after her father is killed and she is essentially a prisoner in King's Landing, she's got this, I mean, she's lost, right? I mean, eventually her mother is killed at the Red Wedding. She's completely cut off from her family. Arya's gone. There's really nothing there for her in King's Landing. And so she turns to people who could help her, but do they help her? Not really, when we're speaking now of the Tyrells. So she has this opportunity to sort of join this sisterhood of noble women, excuse me. So she meets Marjorie and her grandmother, Lady Olenna, and, you know, she's telling them Joffrey's a monster. And so here's Sansa doing them a solid after Joffrey breaks off the engagement with Sansa, okay, because her dad was a traitor, right? Because of that, now Marjorie's lined up to marry Joffrey, and so she's trying to warn them. And what do they do to repay her? They set her up, along with Tyrion, to take the fall for Joffrey's death. Why? Because Tommen is a much more easily manipulable, I think that's a word. He's a much more manipulable person than Joffrey. Joffrey's an animal, and even Marjorie knows that her feminine wiles can't match up with Psycho. Okay, so they decide to essentially take the information from Sansa. Thank you very much. And then they end up killing Joffrey and Sansa gets the blame. So she's used by the Tyrells to get this more favorable king on the throne. Talk about playing the game. And she's just a pawn, and she doesn't even know it. So she really lacks this positive mentor figure in her life, right? I mean, her mom is separated from her and then later killed. Her dad dies in the first season. These female figures who she could turn to really don't give a shit about her. I mean, she's a complete just a tool for them. I mean, we could talk about Cersei, we could talk about Marjorie, we could talk about Olenna. I mean, Sansa has no one. So, is it any surprise, really, that she is becoming more and more disillusioned and vulnerable to somebody like Peter Baelish? And so, that then becomes her second major influence on her as we see her after the death of Joffrey, and she's forced to flee King's Landing. She turns to Baelish as this sort of uncle figure who's extremely creepy, and you know, so he's going to be the one to kind of get her, you know, to a place of safety. And so there's where we sort of meet this, you know, dark Sansa character who, you know, she dyes her hair, she pretends that she's not Sansa. I believe the story, and forgive me, I don't remember the details, but I think she pretends like she's one of Baelish's like distant relatives, and so they go to the Vale, and you know, where of course Baelish has arranged to marry Sansa's aunt. Well, we all know what happens there, as she gets the moon door treatment that Lisa does. And so Baelish is there to act as the steward, essentially, of the Vale, while young Robin, the titty baby, is, left to sort of, be, this young lord of the Vale. And so Sansa is exposed to this really creepy, manipulative world of Littlefinger. And she knows stuff. I mean, he has shown his hand to her. And the Stark part of her would have rebelled against that and turned him in and done the right thing. But because she's been used and abused and just taken advantage of, she's vulnerable at that point to saying, well, gosh, maybe this is the way things really are. Maybe the world is this brutal, awful place. Maybe, gosh, I should learn to play this game. And who better to teach it to me than my mother's old friend, who was, raised with him. And so Sansa, I think, really absorbs a lot of that, those teachings. So Littlefinger then becomes the second major influence on her. And you think, well, what's the other influence? Okay, I'm getting there. So Sansa then, of course, is screwed by Littlefinger when he sells her off to the Boltons, where she loses her virginity. She's married off to a horrible person, Ramsay, who is the worst person that's ever been on this show. And I'll spare, the details of that. We all know what happens. It's awful. I mean, horrible. I have a daughter. It's just, it's awful. And so really the only decent person that she's met since her father died is Tyrion, okay? Tyrion is the only person that she had met up until this point who did not take advantage of her. He could have essentially, raped her, put a baby inside her, all those things, but he did not. And so Tyrion is the only person who's acted with any kind of honor, and she recognizes this. But here she is now. That marriage has been, I suppose, annulled because they never consummated it. I guess that's the story. And so she's married to Ramsay horribly, forced it to marry this guy. And she refuses an opportunity to leave with Brienne the first time. Then, of course, we as we launch into season 6, she actually does get away. And that's where we see the emergence of the third part of Sansa. The third influence, which is what I'm going to call the Tully part. Now, the Stark and Tully parts are similar, but they're not the same. The Tully person is this fiercely devoted, family first, do what it takes person. Very much of a circle the wagons, we're in it for us, very duty bound, okay? Now the Starks are also duty bound and family oriented, but the Starks have these more noble ideals about how to live your life. And I think the Tullys are more practical, more realistic, not as, they're more grounded, let's say, than the Starks are. And so she really embraces the Tully part of her in season 6 and channels her mom. And there's many references made to the fact that she's like her mother. You hear it from Littlefinger. You hear it from the Blackfish when he finally reads Sansa's letter that Brienne delivers. She is making these practical appeals to family and duty. Let's get our home back in Winterfell. I want to preserve our family. These are things that Kat would say. And Catelyn also kind of knew how to deal with her enemies in a more, I think, realistic Game of Thrones fashion, perhaps, than Ned did. Ned had rules. Ned would not cross certain lines. I think Kat had fewer of those lines. I mean, obviously in the books we see that with Lady Stoneheart, where, you know, she becomes vengeance oriented after her death. But so, like, for instance, the way that Sansa essentially manipulates Littlefinger to come and rescue the Starks at the Battle of the Bastards. I mean, I thought for sure that she had promised him marriage, when in fact all she really had to do was sort of lead him on with the implication that, hey, if you come, you can marry me. Well, you know, that's a Tully move. A Stark would have made a promise and then kept the promise. Instead, Sansa doesn't promise anything, and she ends up not having to give anything. She just basically got the Vale's help, at least so far. It looks like she got it for free. We'll see. But, and then the way that she deals with Ramsay at the end, feeding him to the dogs, that's not the Stark way. That's a Tully move. That sort of cold justice, that's a Catelyn decision right there. I mean, Ned would have simply cut his head off and been done with it. And in fact, that's why Jon, when he's, you know, pummeling Ramsay on the ground at the end of episode 9, why he stops. A, he's ashamed. B, it's not the Stark way. And C, you know, Sansa might have something to say about this. So this idea that that Sansa's been in an evolution and being empowered is nothing new. But I think we got to look at those sources of empowerment. And then she's kind of coming back around when she's reunited with Jon at the end of season 6, acknowledging her place as the Stark in Winterfell. Jon puts her there and says, no, you're the Lady of Winterfell. She's coming back again to that Stark piece. So in the way that she's addressing Littlefinger at the end, as far as being, you know, he comes on to her real strong about, be my queen, let me sit on the Iron Throne. Her response is to push him away and say, well, that's a nice dream, but, you know, ain't gonna happen. And so 2 or 3 seasons ago, she would have been very vulnerable to that pitch, and she might have said yes. But now she sees that, no, she is a Stark in Winterfell, and she's also a Tully. And so I think what we're going to see is this acknowledgement of her skills and talents that were learned from Littlefinger. Maybe not using them very often, but at least being aware that they're out there and having this real hard education of disillusionment. You know, that's that. And then coupling that with this sort of Tully practicality. She's a lot more practical from what we've seen than Jon Snow, along with the Stark sense of duty and family and honor. So I think Sansa's positioned to, I mean, she's grown into this three-way person, and I'm really interested to see what happens with her, how she navigates the Littlefinger situation with him up there, how she and Jon work out the power sharing and how that relates back to Jon's heritage. We'll see. But I think Sansa's had a very interesting character arc. And I think that the other thing, just to throw this out there, is that, you know, even though the War for the Dawn is coming, and that's the big series conclusion that we're all aiming towards, I think it's time for a lot of the younger characters to kind of start having babies. I mean, all the noble houses, people are dying, and there's not a lot of, you know, heirs being made, you know, and that's kind of a problem. I mean, I can't think of a single major house that has, you know, babies on the way, and so you think of tradition and carrying on. Well, you know, who's going to carry on the Stark name? Bran? Jon? Sansa? I mean, it's hard to say. If Sansa marries, the name's gone. So we'll see. But I think that it's, you know, obviously there's other political things going on, but I wouldn't be surprised if Sansa ends up getting married. To whom, I have no idea. I've seen a lot of crazy theories out there about that. But, I mean, she clearly does, though, need to be married and create her own family, just like her mother did. So thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.